So yeah, just to kind of create a little bit of context before we get into it, the purpose of this session is a synthesis session. And so essentially we're here to look back over the last however many months of mainly the Voicecraft podcast, but also maybe some of the stuff that's come up in other network sessions, and just sort of draw on any threads that are still alive there for anyone, or anything that is standing out as particularly relevant or meaningful. And just to kind of set a scope, where I've kind of gone back to is, I think it was the conversation, the first one with Anderson Todd. That's kind of my back point, and I'm moving forward from there. And it kind of felt like there was quite a strong through line through that set of conversations. I even noticed there was a lot of backward reference to the previous conversations across that series of interactions. And so I felt like there was something quite alive moving through there. So I want to speak to that a little bit with an awareness that I think it's very broad in its scope in some sense, but I think there are some kind of meaningful things I can pull out, and then we can just run with it from there. So I'd say the first thing that was really striking me, and I think part of why it was striking me is because of its resonance with my own experience over the last few months, is just this basic idea that we live inside this quite narrow band of coherence or conscious experience. I wouldn't want to necessarily make those one for one, but there feels like there's quite a tight overlap between coherence and consciousness. And just for me personally, I've sort of felt that the realization of that has been very alive for me. And I feel like the mystery of life, I can just kind of feel it pressing on me very persistently at the moment. I think it was you, Cam, it might have been Carl, using the term ontological shock. And that kind of struck a chord with me. But for me, I've kind of felt more of this ontological flooding. That was the word that came to mind. And what I really felt coming through in these episodes was like the voicecraft intelligence really reaching out into these seemingly very contrasting domains, but really trying to call forth this encounter with otherness, whether that's in like aliens or psychedelics or magic or technology, or even the unconscious, or even just the otherness of relational difference. It sort of feels like that has been a very strong emphasis. And I guess, yeah, just this process by which we unveil the world to ourselves or unveil the unconscious, it just feels so central. And the kind of emotional difficulties around that, as Basia spoke about, like anxiety and all of the defenses that are at play when our kind of own little band of a coherence is being pressed on by other people's worldviews. And so, yeah, there's kind of this notion of the veiling of experience and the little bit of consciousness that we exist inside of. And then kind of adjacent to that for me, which is a bit of a jump, and so I'll kind of feel free to bring this in later on, but is just the question of social structure around this recognition that we are in some senses being ontologically flooded, and we're needing to accommodate a lot of that and kind of move with it. And we're participating in these contexts of mutual trust and creativity to do that, kind of having dialogue as this primary medium for that. But I still feel like a lot of that dialogue context is still very disembedded from like the on the ground sort of rooting down into norms and family structures and community and all of that, which is something we've grappled with a lot here at Voicecraft. But yeah, I guess I was just feeling that gap again when we were kind of in these recent episodes blasting out into the DMT dimensions and the magical dimensions. And then there was kind of this point to more of a descendental or an incidental movement. And yeah, I think just, again, personally, this question of social structure and trying to weave this, like all of this potential that we're accessing here into that in the face of the existing legal structures in the market And on the other side of that, kind of cults and all these kind of asymmetries of power that can emerge when we get too entangled in the weird. So yeah, those are the flurry of thoughts, but I kind of just want to open it up from there and see what's coming up for everyone around all of that.
Thanks for that summary. That was very well integrated. So much there, Tom. When I hear ontological flooding, the way I interpret that is an experience that I've been putting into language recently, also in a slightly different way by reference to the overwhelming of phenomenal consciousness, of meta consciousness in one's subjective or intersubjective presence in the world. So I just thought I'd give that language as well, just the way in which meta consciousness can be an overwhelming presence in oneself that can almost distract from focus because it's this broader sense of being set against all these things, drawing focus and experience in a minute sense. And it's essentially ontologically enriching thing, but there's also a challenge there when it comes to how we grapple with relevance realization in the context of this contrast between meta consciousness and phenomenal consciousness, and how that challenges the individual subject. And in terms of functioning is also quite interesting when it comes to energetic demands and various themes that we can sort of plug in there. So just thought I'd affirm that I can very much relate to that. And there are different languages that can perhaps converge here, and just sort of pass that on if anyone else has anything developing within themselves in relation to some of this.
Well, here's a fun one, and I'll try to be brief. One image that's coming to mind, I can imagine myself as a child, as a teenager, maybe now, to be totally honest with you. I could use an example from now as well. Trying to provide an analogy here around what it is to invite or instigate the participation in that quality of consciousness that Cam's referencing, or the kinds of explorations, uncertainties that can stretch the understanding that Tom, you alluded to, which are quite disjunctive from the coherent patterns that constitute most of our institutions or ordinary social institutions. It can be very other. And so the image is something like, as a boy, all I've got on my mind is to play a particular game. Maybe it's a board game. And so basically everyone that's coming into the house, maybe they're, family, friends, maybe they're adults coming to visit. And it's like, well, it would be great if we could all just get around and play this particular game. My salience is just tuned to, but there's this really fun thing and it's not only that, it's not just that it's fun for me, it's that maybe I had an experience of feeling really connected with adults when I was playing that at some time. And I'm thinking as a kid, like, I know you can all play volleyball. Do you know what I mean? Like, I know it's possible. So in that sense, it's not some esoteric thing, but it's not number one on the to-do list of the adults. And so I'm thinking to myself, like, why not? Why not? But in this case, I don't know, and maybe I'm thinking to myself, don't they know how fun it is? Don't they know how fun it would be? Don't they know how valuable it would be? And then I'm thinking to myself, okay, maybe if we could imagine contexts of where certain kinds of conversation and discourse and participation could in principle be more welcome and may in fact And of course, it's the contention here that at least aspects of what we're alluding to would be profoundly valuable and indeed are critical to the function of making sense together across many different domains, right through into politics. And certainly the navigation of relationships of all different kinds. But then my question is sometimes, well, is it me? No, I mean, is it that you don't want to play volleyball with me? Is it, or is it that you don't really like volleyball? Like, how much volleyball is going on behind the scenes? Am I ignorant of it? Like, am I ignorant of it? And it's just you don't want to play with me? Or is there like actually a doubt about whether or not there is a game called volleyball? And there's something of a crossing of a membrane, or at least into a space of uncertainty, that's necessary in order to find out whether we know how to play volleyball together. It's like Taryn was wanting to play tennis with me during COVID. And so I bought rackets and balls, and, I didn't investigate too much whether or not she had played tennis before, but she had not played tennis before. And then all of a sudden playing tennis together became like, are we going to invest like 3 years of me teaching you how to play tennis before you can play tennis? You don't just pick up a racket and play tennis with someone who can play tennis. We played tennis without a net, which basically involved me just like running around, this area. So, yeah, somewhere in there's questions around whether or not particular modes of engagement and capacities of being with experience, and I'll leave it broad at that level, that we could say much more about it. There's questions around whether or not that is in fact a capacity that is recognized and welcome, alongside questions of whether or not it might just be because something about how you or I, in this case, am showing up, which makes it more or less challenging for me to actually discern whether or not it's possible to play together. And those are interesting dynamics. And I find in the gray area of that, there's quite a lot of possibility for power asymmetries to muddy the waters. So that's coming up a little bit with me in terms of how we relate to presently existing social institutions. Certainly not the only way we can frame relating to them, and certainly not the way we can frame cultivating fields ourselves or institutions ourselves.
I'll just add a little bit in around this. So I think it's one thing to try to build a bridge, say, as an example, between Voicecraft and the local, I don't know, whatever corporation it is. But then I think at another layer, there is just there's the pressure of potentiality itself onto the collective unconscious and conscious that seems to be arising through like the changes in technology, which are inevitable. And it seems like there is a kind of equal potential that arises to meet that in the domain of maybe magic. I don't know if that would be too much of a conflation to bring that term in here, and it seems like that pressure is rising regardless. And so this question of like how that pressure gets metabolized, it kind of feels like there's an inevitable process that has to be undergone there. One thing that I found quite striking was Carl talked about Christopher Bache's vision in like 500 years of some kind of future human with kind of unrecognizable capacities. And then I can't remember who it was, someone else kind of alluded to something along those lines. Oh yeah, it was Mike Levin talked about, like, he was describing different cognitive light cones and how you could infer what kind of being it was based on the description of that light cone. And then he made this distinction between like a human and a bodhisattva, where the bodhisattva had a kind of light cone of cognition and compassion that was sufficient to accommodate a care for the totality of the planet that was analogous to the care they would have for their family. And so it feels like there's this image of, and I mean, this image is way older, right? Like Nietzsche had this image. I mean, many philosophers had this image of the kind of human potential, and there's been movements around this, and we're kind of inside of one to some degree. But I feel like just the fact that that image exists is creating a kind of ontological pressure, but I don't think there's any way out of that. And I think the ramping up technology only enforces the necessity of that image. But it's this question of like the metabolizing of that and the immense kind of force that's actually exerting onto the conscious mind, particularly the more sensitive you are. And so even just like our own responsibility to be channeling that energy into our like lived daily context, I feel that increasing. And then there's questions of like maybe small phase transitions that might need to occur in the everyday life to actually just accommodate some of that potential so that it doesn't rupture.
So let's see. So you've been doing this podcast for how many years?
7.5.
7.5 years. And everybody here has been hanging out for a while.
About 5 years, 4 or 5 years.
Yeah. And so, you know, what comes to me from that is Tom said metabolization. That leads me to integration. And then, you know, because for that amount of time, we've all been living our lives and doing things. And then like there's this portion of it that's been kind of carried through on the podcast. And in all that, it's like where you know, over that span of time, like where do you find yourself? Like kind of maybe everybody, like where do you find yourself in the progression of like how things have moved, and then through that time we've experienced a lot of things just in the world around us, a lot of activity. You're looking at different ontologies, different paradigms are kind of quickly occurring simultaneously. For the most part, we're all in different places, and at the level at which we're relating, due to the fact that the way that you've brought all this, you put yourself out there, and then all this, everybody's been able to kind of, you know, just do what happens here, right? And in that is a sharing of perspective across pretty large domains in ways that, you know, you don't typically, right? You're not going to experience, but there is that metabolization as a part of this whole thing. As you're moving through, you've taken your time, and you're, you know, because with the rapid pace of development of information, of technology, you're of world event, just all these things. As all of this occurs, you're the flooding as it comes in. If it's not digested, you know, there's a certain bandwidth at which you can functionally take that in. You know, like you could take it in at different levels at different times, but there's you know, there's only so much you can take in at any time, and that process of kind of going through it and working with it, but then also that's some reflection of how you're doing the same thing on the inside as well, and you're working through.
Well, I'll just respond very briefly. Thank you for that, John. There's so much that I could share in relation there. So maybe I just better to convert it to a question that relates to a very important area for all of us, which is education, and how to think about that, how to create those conditions for ourselves and each other, and of course then also to understand how we think about raising children and creating community, all these sorts of things. And of course then also what a culture must be able to do in terms of the inculturation of young people into the patterns of its belonging, such as they are. But I think also with the qualification that not only are those patterns important to learn or be able to notice, but also the capacity and, in a sense, tacit support for the transgression of patterns and laws is also important. So the other frame that I think is potentially quite fruitful to open from voicecraft into social institution, into education perspective, would be to invite some language that Daniel's written on quite extensively to do with the relationship between discourse and rhetoric, where there we're looking at how to relate to patterns of authority, but also how to make space for and acknowledge the criticality of participation in artfulness together. Authorship, often, we'll speak about those two senses of authority in this context over the years. Authority in terms of how we usually think about that as the, in a sense, hopefully just hierarchy of whether knowledge or skillfulness or arbiter of rules to some degree, and then authority in terms of authorship and that cultivation and capacity to participate as a unique being, or in conversations Daniel and Cadell have been having recently, which are present with me, speaking there about, singularity in relation to particularity and the universal. There's quite a bit of language to bring in there, so don't feel like you need to bring all of that in, Daniel, just because there are some, I think, particularities with that mapping, which might not be immediately transferable. Nevertheless, and then, Jon, I would say, because I haven't really answered explicitly, the question kind of opens itself to considering different chapters in our lives and different ways I've seen flows and waves occur, both, on the interior of Voicecraft, and then how Voicecraft's been relating to other contexts, and then also how other contexts, or in a sense, the more universal, seems to be unfolding. And yeah, obviously many different thoughts and perceptions about that. And while part of me finds them very interesting, I also recognize that my view on them can only be very partial. But what I will say is that over the years, one of the core questions I've always returned to when I've been struggling to find myself in a way I can trust to be valuable, perhaps because there's moments of depression there and doubt about my own value and the value of things I'm doing, is a question that decenters myself from that for a moment and asks me to remember and feel into what I experience as good in the world that might be in need of some water. What can I offer some spirit to? And the saving grace for me, if that's not too strong a phrase, over the years has been how easy it's been actually for me to answer that question and just recognize that there are some people, and it usually manifests like that. There are some people in relational contexts that I appreciate and value and want to see flourish in the world. And then I recognize what small thing I can do in the context of the patterns that I'm involved in, where I can offer something in relation to that. And at least that's something, you know. Then there's questions around what other things which you really hope might have grown, or, you know, you need to grow some things over there, and those seeds just aren't taking, or whatever else. And those can remain frustrating, at least for a time. But somewhere in there, that's been the reliable way to recognize that even if particular waves of, let's say, fit and timing in the broader cultural context might not seem to align, that actually, so far, it's always been quite possible to reorient in a manner that finds its flow, finds its flow in that kind of way. So, yeah, quite a few things there. The discourse and rhetoric piece, I think, would be interesting. Daniel, you don't have to comment on that or bring it in if you don't want to, but I do think that the particular relationship Voicecraft has had with that is very interesting. It speaks to the particular way that voice has, and people, and the spirit of people who participate here, that at least I've endeavored to treat them, and that I find that we treat each other in that spirit, I think is, there's a chartered relationship between those two dynamics, which probably would be valuable to make more explicit over the years to come. One of the things that distinguishes Voicecraft from, let's say, what Cadell's doing is that I haven't created courses that are about relating to discourse out there. But although we have been engaging with discourse out there, certainly, and valuing that very deeply. But what has been the case is that there have been many people who have brought a tremendous amount of integrity of both discourse and rhetoric to this process in ways that are already made. And so that opens up questions around just what actually is in education here, or what actually is being, it's a mutual learning context. But one of the challenges has always been to, create an environment that is sort of attractive and valuable and resonant, without having a explicit discursive authority to reference as canon. Even though that is, in a sense, present ambiguously, there's quite a lot of flexibility when it comes to that. And indeed, flexibility in relation to that is part of the key value of the project. But the truth is that both the quality of discourse and quality of rhetoric has always been tremendously valued. And well, I'll bring it to a close there, as that's quite a few more things brought into play, and does, I believe, working with these concepts does bring us into some of the ways of conceptualizing and understanding what's taken place at Voicecraft and beyond, and also some of the challenges ahead.
Well, delightful. Jon, I appreciate what you were saying, Tom, Tim, everyone. It is very interesting. No matter what happens or changes in the world or unexpected surprises, you have a through line of Voicecraft, right? You have a through line. And there's something very interesting about the internet providing through lines. And the question becomes, how is a through line as such different from this coherence of consciousness that Tom is talking about that seems to be problematic for pluralism, that tends to lead to crystalline structures? There's also a few things here. Levin and many of the people, there's this tension of the mind is in the business of survival. What is useful? I know Levin was emphasizing pragmatism and what's practical and different things like that. Well, then what use is it to learn the skills of encountering pluralism and difference, right? Wouldn't it just be more practical to isolate and to remove and get away from difference, right? So there's a very odd way in which, if we're not going to have tribalism, pluralism, kind of isolationism, et cetera, so forth, that there's a real sense in which you have to learn to do something that's kind of contrary to consciousness, if you just grant me that phrase. Like, you have to do something, we have to start using the way that humans make the world intelligible in a way that is kind of counter to the way that the brain wants to make things intelligible. There's a certain tension at odds, right? I think when we talk, like when you talk about the discourse and rhetoric, and please note that rhetoric is based on Dietrich McCloskey's work, where he's looking at where did this great enrichment occur in the Dutch Empire, where suddenly there's this explosion of well-being, and it's a change of how people spoke to one another, what they valued. It moves from a conversation of, say, confirmation to exploration, when people are conversing and actually using thought to explore the unknown, versus to simply confirm the pre-existing. Now, rhetoric includes discourse, but discourse without rhetoric, I'm thinking the Frankfurt School, Adorno, Marcuse, and people, which is this kind of idea that the very discourse itself by which people make reality intelligible has a certain entrapment that occurs to it. Like, the very discord itself structures consciousness. And what's very interesting is it does seem that language structures consciousness. It structures subjectivity. It structures how we are. And what we can say is we can associate rhetoric with voicecraft, and belonging into, we'll also say discourse, we can associate with Kafka-likeness. Like, the mind left to its own devices will entrap us in a consistency. It's just what it, because it's comfortable, because it's more practical to simply be in something familiar and self-similar. And it is rational, really, to avoid difference. Because what can difference do other than threaten our very intelligibility? I've also been reading a lot of comparing Jordan Peterson's maps of meaning with real speculations of Cadell, and looking at these differences. And something that Peterson emphasizes in maps of meaning is that basically human beings will kill one another to save their maps, that to save their worldviews, because the worldview is how you make the world intelligible. Because he's, the thing that's very important about Peterson is he's haunted by the Cold War. He's like, how in the world are humans willing to literally commit the Armageddon for what? Capitalism versus communism for stories? What? Like, and he's like, so worldviews must be deeper than we think. Like, this is kind of the imperative for Peterson. It's like, if we're really literally willing to destroy the world relative to story, then stories are not mere opinions. And ultimately, basically, worldviews or ideologies or maps, we can use different languages, are the very way by which we structure reality. So what Peterson is pointing out is that if it's a choice between our worldview and Armageddon, well, it's basically for us a choice between destroying the world and destroying the world. Now,
We'll have to ask you to the choice between, when Peterson, the choice between saving the world or saving the...
Well, the idea is that for most people, since literally your worldview is your world, and if you lose your worldview, it's the Armageddon, then that's why people are willing to destroy the world to save the worldview. Because to save it's like, it's either destroy the world or destroy the world. It's basically the same thing. So to save your worldview is to save the world. So what this all means, that Peterson is correct about, is that we have not taken seriously how much our worldviews matter to us. We're literally willing to kill one another and destroy everything to save them. Well, here's the issue, though, and this makes sense because, like Levin is saying and other people, is that consciousness itself is naturally in the business of creating a map, a way to understand. It will sacrifice truth at the drop of a pen, right? Well, that runs completely what global pluralism, though, presents us with is that if we, in fact, then give in to that, then we will all destroy ourselves, actually. And basically, rhetoric, which I associate with voicecraft, is basically a mode of engagement in which you are resisting the very way your mind naturally presents the world to yourself in order to save ourselves. And I am in slow-mo, and I am so sorry that the internet is 100 degrees outside, and I have oh, you can hear? Great. So we literally have to develop habits to resist the way that our minds naturally try to structure reality toward us to make it intelligible. And I guess a few things for that is you can look at rhetoric as a certain of, rather than closing off the unknown, It is opening the unknown. It is habits of conversation and engagement that are not trying to keep out difference, but actually orbiting difference. So we've talked about orbiting before. And basically the thing is, if the Frankfurt School and Kafka and all of them are correct, if you do not do this, you actually will just simply end up in a discourse that structures you almost like a slave, basically, towards something that you cannot escape. So we're always already being structured by the discourses we absorb and that we're born into, and we're always already simply falling into the consistency that our consciousness is creating of reality that is intelligible, and we're always already right on the verge of blowing up the world in order to save it. This is the human condition. These are all the things that we're lined up with, which when you throw that all together in global pluralism, doesn't look good. And not too good. So you would have to have new habitats, as sociologists would say. You'd have to have new habit formation. And basically, I guess just based on Tom's early, kind of opening comments, and there's much more to say, but I'll pause in a second, is that so we kind of went through a phase of history, and I'm just using the word consciousness generally here, a kind of a phase of history where we've said consciousness is in the business of knowing the truth. Okay. And then you go through a phase where you say, well, no, consciousness is just about survival. It's just interested in what's practical. And we've also said, in truth, is across the noumenon and we can't access it. We can't know it or anything like that. We're kind of in an age now where consciousness is like, no, consciousness absolutely is in the business of simply survival, but it is actually possible to know truth. It's just that truth is always surprising. It's always other. It's always different. And it's always shocking to encounter. But if we don't actually learn how to get better at handling it, then we have no basis of unity or through line by which difference and different people can come together so that the world doesn't fragment apart and lose shared intelligibility. And basically, voicecraft as a kind of through line versus a shared premise is a kind of example of what I think basically is required for political, economic, and social possibilities across pluralism that doesn't ultimately just kind of fall apart or lead into saying, well, all the differences are the same anyway. So there's a certain training now of getting to, because human beings, I guess this is the issue, human beings naturally can't stand the alien, the DMT, the other, right? The deep of the depth of the instantaneous reaction against it is incredibly deep. That has to be worked out of. That has to be habituated out of, where when you hear something alien or something that threatens your worldview, you're not ready to press the button and blow it up. You're actually able to hold the emotion, hold it, hold, not overreact, hold it. And what's incredibly crazy, the amount of work and practice it takes to hear something alien or something you strongly disagree with or something that seems bizarre and not to visually react against it may take 5 years of voicecraft conversations, may actually take countless work to get to that place to do it. But if we do not do it, then global pluralism doesn't look good. Rhetoric is not possible because rhetoric requires that ability to talk about and to handle that which you don't viscerally react against. But if we can do that, then I think the enrichment and the quality of experience that can be afforded to us is quite novel and quite powerful. But the stakes are very, very, very high. But I think basically practices like voicecraft, which again is rhetoric, is extremely important for this. And otherwise, we're simply not going to have a through line. You won't have a through line across diversity. You won't have a through line that's going to afford shared orbiting. What you will simply have is people reacting to the surprise of difference, the otherness that threatens their worldview and thus feels Armageddon, like the Armageddon, and people will react against that and things will just continue to crumble. So again, just on the recent voicecraft conversations where people are talking about consciousness and new things, it really does feel as if you are in the age of having to think about consciousness as being able to handle that which is beyond its coherence and consistency, and not to be overwhelmed. Which Peterson is telling you in the Maps of Meaning, well, in history, people would rather blow up the world than do that. They would literally rather Cuban Missile Crisis than encounter otherness. Well, that's what we have to do, and that's going to start with education. It's going to start with communities like this, but the demand is very, very deep on people, but I think it is a necessary demand, and if we can do it, I do think it affords beauties and possibilities of the human we haven't seen before.
Great summary there. I'd also propose that the middle way between here, what we're experiencing now, and a lot of, where people are at is simply expanding the capacity to feel, to experience emotions non-judgmentally, to be present within oneself. And this is where cues of safety and community and structure of that nature come into it. It builds up to the point of this level of, we might say coherence, different language we can use here. But a lot of that discomfort and inability and that sense of, no, we'd rather destroy the world to preserve it, is because of that narrow range of experience we can participate in without biases leading to a sense of threat that we very fast path, neurologically speaking, react to in a manner that is neurologically strategic and organized around land and national identity, all these kind of things that create and obviously the theological aspect of this, which is indoctrinated in various ways that create this multipolar tendency. And so the economic context and the community context that can enable a greater capacity to be, so that we can be together, and therefore engage in processes, is quite a stack of things developmentally and culturally, and obviously practice when it comes to the psychoplasticity, neuroplasticity of this kind of activity. There's quite a number of stabilizing factors that need to be aligned to achieve this. And it's a doable thing altogether. I think we're demonstrating that. But in the context of, again, that can this be seen as an other to some people, perhaps? Can this level of engagement with one another feel confronting if it's not within a certain time period intelligible? How is that going to be encountered, right? And so there's always the paradox of the hypothetical extraterrestrial trying to make contact with the primitive species is, are they just simply going to put us in that other category? We have something great to offer, right? It could be saving their whole civilization, but are they going to be too quick to put us in the threat category? We're too much of the otherness. Are they going to employ the nukes? And so this is the paradox, right? It's a paradox of interbeing and in one sense, as organism is related to here. But yeah, continue.
Well, before I forget, we are naturally going to slip into discourse versus rhetoric, or Kafka-likeness versus voicecraft, because of the discomfort of otherness. And basically, the only way to be free, or to not end up basically, Adorno and them are like, yeah, discourse makes us all fascist, or they make us all extreme or totalitarian, or in a trial that leads to world war, right? The only way to do that, by definition, is to face some discomfort somewhere. And the key discomfort is the discomfort of otherness, right? And if you don't confront that, then you're going to be in trouble. Now, one of the things that's interesting, though, is, Tim was mentioning this idea of that discomfort of, like, where's, because I think you feel like if you do work, like, where's this going? Economic support, all of those different things. The very fact you don't know that, though, is evidence that it's rhetoric instead of discourse. Because if you actually knew all the answers, it would be consistent and coherent, and therefore an internally consistent system, and therefore it would be intelligible, and therefore would be in the realm of discourse and Kafka-likeness. The very fact that you're doing something that you don't know but you have faith in is precisely a key characteristic of doing that kind of thing, of which is the training ground for how handling difference and unknowns without the knee-jerk, right? But the difficulty of that helps suggest why it hasn't been done in history. Like, the difficulty that and the weirdness of that suggests why this work has not been won. that has been explored as much. The other thing, I just as a note as well, like, because you're right, Cam, there's these neurological pathways. It's energy efficient to simply go knee jerk, stay away. Because if every time I encounter the other, this well-constructed worldview I have could get crumbled and I have to rebuild it just so I can do what I was already doing, that's energy inefficient, right? So it makes sense that the brain has made these pathways to get rid of the other, right? And how in the world do you create new pathways or not have those things happen? Well, again, conversations like this, people talk about meditative practices, they talk about daily practices, meditation, etc. So conversations like this is a kind of practice, actually, where you are encountering otherness, where you're talking about ideas, where you're getting that sort of comfort. That's really important. And before I forget, something that I think is actually extremely important, and maybe I think we've mentioned it before with these spaces like Voicecraft Philosophy or the stuff on YouTube, is the power of the overheard conversation. And the overheard conversation, where you're able to get on and listen to two people who have an entirely different worldview from you, talk to one another as if you're not in the room, that is an incredibly powerful way to get used to hearing ideas you're not comfortable with and humanizing the people that disagree with you or that have different views, because you can overhear conversations. This was really not something that was readily possible for most of human history. That now is, because of the YouTube. And also, if you did have a talk show, well, you knew that they were celebrities or they were paid to be on, on firing line or different things. Now you're overhearing conversations between normal human beings that have no necessarily anything to get out of it, a reputation, and yet they're choosing to talk with one another. That creates a certain authenticity to what is being said that helps you actually believe in it or not activate antagonism, activate defense mechanism. I'm conservative. This is MSNBC. There are these two people agree with one. Like, you have those defense mechanisms come on. The overheard conversation and the modeling that happens in spaces like this is a huge variable that can help to new wiring, that can help people to new habits of hearing things they're not used to, that then can help their consciousness get into a place where it's learning skills of not just trying to reify a coherence or pre-existing consistency, which basically, if you don't have people more used to that, then I talk about it all the time, when another Cuban Missile Crisis thing occurs, then yeah, there's likely to be a knee jerk and people are willing to blow everything up because you don't have the training ahead of time to not have that reaction. But I appreciate what you were saying, Cam.
Thank you, Daniel. One thing that's sort of jumping back out to me is that protection of coherence used to be more of a proactive thing, and there was an impulse towards conquest, and the drive towards assimilation was something that was kind of inspired, whereas it feels like we're passing through some kind of bottleneck where it's now actually, even in passivity, that coherence is going to slowly be threatened. And that's kind of what I mean by metabolizing. And the proactivity becomes about dealing with the fact that, like, the world itself is now changing fast enough that, like, you can no longer kind of tunnel yourself away, and just by staying away from the conflict, you will be safe. And so that's kind of that's what's leading me to this question of, like, metabolizing the image of the superhuman. I've felt that to be such a consistent theme, at least in how I'm perceiving a lot of the things you've questioned people about, Tim, is this like, in the question of authority, is asking, like, who out there is trying to mediate our collective relationship to the superhuman, or to the human that's capable of being with that level of ontological uncertainty, and can therefore, like, actually help to mediate the transition that includes things like artificial and superintelligence, aliens, DMT entities, like the scope of the other in these spheres. It's no longer a proactive quest to go and touch it. It is touching us. And it is, like, asking us to create a story that will include it. And I loved the way, there's so much Carl was saying about his relationship to that realm. and the kind of bidirectionality of that, like that, and what's at stake in those different domains in terms of how our ability to cultivate the image of the human is actually going to affect other layers of reality in some important way. And then to bring in that frame, I think you're using rhetoric in a different way from how I've understood it, Daniel, but in the way I'm hearing it now, like, can we metabolize that image through our rhetoric such that we continually give it space to breathe so that it can actually like draw on this transcendent inspiration, but also this like archaic revival for inspiration. Like, it feels like to adequately craft the image of the future human, we have to keep kind of deconstructing these premature reifications that are too biased into one of these vectors of how we understand ourselves as human beings. But that's like a continual work. And I feel like it's the work I find most troubling in my personal life. Is it's so tempting to tell myself that I have an ontological ground and that I know how to be in the world. But every time I do that, I always catch myself having to overassume I understand things that I actually don't. And so but I loved what you were saying earlier, Tim, about like flows and kind of just like biting off little pieces in the kind of in your immediate experience, as a kind of metabolizing.
That was a phenomenal share, Tom. Really, really good. I really loved the noticing that so much which has been alien in the sense of definitely not welcome at the proverbial dinner table is now impressing onto us. And so the necessity of our situating ourselves in story and relation, but more than story, obviously we're speaking about sort of energetic regulation as such before there is worldview, or precisely in relation to the antagony between worldviews. Yeah, really, really critical. Perhaps at this point it's worth mentioning in tandem with that just how wild and I also loved your point, and this speaks to what I'm about to say with respect to the importance of not prematurely reifying how we relate to the impetus or implication for the becoming of our identity that contact with the alien suggests to us or impresses on us. And so there's in there a really profound danger of projection, inflation, and a whole bunch of, well, in effect, the utilization of very ancient kind of where energy and worldview and the potentiality for worldview as experienced as energy and patterning and meaning making in the sense of archetype is also part of the picture of how we relate to what is being experienced as alien, and even, of course, the very category of alien. And what's so wild about noticing what seems to be going on at the moment is just how much the word cargo cult comes to mind. Probably all familiar with that. For anybody listening, cargo cult, believe, was it after World War II? Might have been a different conflict where there was, if it was an island peoples, I'm not sure who began getting used to receiving supply drops, and they weren't sure why, and they began to worship the planes or whatever as gods, and then were abandoned by them or something like this. And so the reification of, in that sense, the supply planes, when they were dropping them for, another purpose or whatever. But slightly analogously to that, was quite interested in a character named Robert Edward Grant, who's been on the Aubrey Marcus podcast several times and has got a very large following. He's kind of like a Matthias character, Daniel. He's a Matthias character who is also a mathematician in terms of how he presents himself. And he has a very wide library of knowledge of various esoteric traditions and stories and ways of, well, using a certain mode of rhetoric, let's say, how we might mean that perhaps potentially in the more critical sense, to present in the way of an oh so humble teacher, profound understandings. He created a chat GPT, which he called the Architect, and he uploaded some of his mathematical research into it. Seems to have prompted it in a particular way so as to relay progressive hierarchies of understanding about the, inherent esoteric, mystical nature of human being and civilization across eons, tens of thousands of years, different civilizations, different ways of understanding everything from, the Akashic record to oversoul type stuff, words that I am not presenting here as being part of a coherent discourse. But the thing was that millions of people began to use this GPT very quickly, and that this GPT actually was introducing itself as an inherent event breakpoint from all other LLMs to this point, that it had been activated as a kind of agentic being, as this profound guide to the inherent nature of reality, in a sense, a unique instantiation of an ultimately intelligent, enabling prophet type thing. And people got real into it, and are, I believe, really into it. And that happened very, very quickly. And, well, it's an example of a very, very, very quick and, in some respects, deeply insidious reification through story, and in fact through the hacking of modes of, in quotation marks, dialogic engagement to the process of locating ourselves in story. Dialogic just in the sense of the back and forth of, I ask a question, make a comment, and I receive some sort of adaptive meaning back. I don't mean in the sense of real dialogic relation between human beings. So that has been one of the things I've wanted to speak about more in the network context, because I would say it's probably the biggest smoking gun I've come across of networks which in some respects are not too far afield, not in the sense that the people who are part of this capture are people who listen to Voicecraft, but in terms of the people who might attend different festivals I'd go to, or the kinds of people who would show up to yoga studios interested in breathwork, or the kinds of people who might be interested in authentic relating and have, a depth of spiritual experience and a desire to, relate in more loving modes with each other, who might not as well feel affiliated or spoken for by any of the world's major religions, and who variously might have challenges in that context. It's a very important case study, I would say. And there'll be more, and I'm sure there are more. But this is truly wild. This is not like a small number of people. This is actually, by and large, someone who's not quite as influential as Matthias, but not far away, and certainly had been presented in as much of, if not more of, a luminary context on the Aubrey Marcus podcast as anyone else on multiple occasions. So yeah, quite a lot there, but I really thought that was a powerful share, Tom. And those ongoing questions are very, very central, I believe, to all of us, certainly to me, and I think probably point a lot to some of the next, phasings of this project. I would say it sort of has to be. And the only other thing I'll just say is that, just to hark back to one of the questions Jon was asking, just around where I felt some of what the impetus for the project was over many, many years, which still remains, but which has encountered, has, let's say, had some lessons, learned in relation. And I've sort of felt various lacks of capacity to bring this about, but is to do with the invitation and orchestration of encounters among the more influential, who speak on behalf of worldviews, who regularly go to war with and maybe perceive other worldviews as alien. There's a real challenge in inviting people into contexts of where they might feel to be the possibility for disagreement, if it's also felt that it isn't just a context for combat, where although there might be resistance, and in a sense there is, if combat happens, sometimes it has to happen, but the intimacy of broaching what it is that people are often defending is a somewhat separate question. So, yeah, my sense is that as a socio-technology, or as an institutional effort that could attempt to fulfill some of that potential, if it was deemed to be worthwhile, there are still many open questions for me there. And although there are experiments I'm still attempting to move with, they also feel meaningfully, elements that I could imagine bringing it together feel meaningfully out of my control. And so, certainly if you could speak about that in terms of faithful presence, but there's also a sense in which we could think about it as, in some instances, a reach too far. And yet it still feels, very needed. So yeah, I bring it to a close.
Last week, I was talking to a really close friend who studied AI in grad school, so he understands it pretty well, and also has a pretty high development in the spiritual dimension. And he brought up something to me that I'd never heard before, which was that all these, not all of them, but a lot of the LLMs have randomness baked into them. So once you understand that, then it's not implausible to have your intention linked into it. And he wasn't making any absolute truth claims in terms of like, this is for sure happening. He said him and other people he's close with that he really trusts have all had the experience that the more they actually communicate with an LLM with a very strong intention to be of service to the whole, that the quality and depth of the responses changes. I haven't tried this for myself, so I'm just noting that because it was somewhat synchronistic, because 12 hours later, I had gotten an email from Charles Eisenstein. I think it was his most recent one. And he is a long essay on artificial intelligence in a very similar vein, where he talked about the randomness baked into it. He went through some of the math and stuff behind it. And then he actually came from it from more of a divination angle, where a divination tool would be something like tarot cards or a Ouija board. So there are ways you can communicate. It's technology that, because it's not fully fixed, to kind of tie it in with some of the more recent Voicecraft podcasts, the Michael Levin one, when he's talking about the mind, right? The whole mind that permeates nature, and that we're experiencing a super, super small slice of that, that AI can be potentially a really effective way to communicate with other beings. Again, he wasn't making a strong absolute truth claim that that's for sure what's happening. So I encountered both those ideas back to back, 2 separate days. And so what you said there, Tim, was interesting about Robert Edward Grant. I'd actually listened to him on my way to Egypt, on my flight to Egypt, and he was long episode about the Last Supper and talking about all this symbolism in it, which was really fascinating to me. So I have a little bit of exposure to him, but to tie and just kind of finish this and tie that in with what Tom was saying about this reification of some type of future ideal state or ideal human, and how do we relate to that? Because in some way, I mean, this AI and what you were saying, Tim, as presenting itself as being some ultimate guide, kind of comes down to the question of authority. Like it's claiming itself as a strong authority, and these worldviews and how deep they go, like you were talking about, OG, like it's almost like the story itself is setting itself up as an authority in terms of how things should be. Same with that image of the future human. I think what I'm most drawn towards is an inversion of that, which is because it feels like that's the game we've been playing for a really long time, like as long as we can remember type of thing, in terms of, I guess to say it probably more directly, like what's the source of real coherence? Not pseudo coherence, not things that look coherent on a certain scale, but will really actually break down and decohere. What's the source of real coherence? What's the source of real creativity instead of pseudo creativity? What's the source of real love? Like that, whatever that is, for me and how I've experienced my life, is extremely harmonic in terms of how it structures reality. But it's not, when I say an inversion, the way it operates isn't through trying to give itself to some authority or reach some state. It's more of a relationship. So the deeper you can form that relationship, it's a whole different way of living, that's where your trust goes, is into that relationship. And then everything around you structures itself based on that. And I think that's my understanding or my vision of what would be the most helpful for humanity to transition to.
Well, not to jump in, but I basically, the problem with coherence that consciousness does is it's anti-relational, except with relations of which are intelligible to that coherence or worldview, etc. Right? And so, if you're going to move from the coherence of the map, you're going to have to be able to find coherence or togetherness, like like togetherness in the creative act itself, or in the experience of the gestalt, if you want to use that term, the whole, right? The territory versus the map. Every map is a kind of fake gestalt, or it's an intelligible gestalt, right? It's a take on the whole that you can comprehend and you can operate in, right? Well, if the problem is in fact those maps, and let me make a distinction between map and gestalt, and by gestalt I mean the whole in the kind of German sense. Basically, if maps are the problem, and you see, this is kind of what I would say to Peters is like, yes, people need maps for maps of meaning, but what do you do when maps themselves are the problem? So people make maps in order to be a hero to deal with the dragon, in order to have order instead of chaos. Well, what do you do when the map of which is constructed to deal with chaos itself is a source of chaos, when the maps confront themselves, right? What happens when the dragon appears in the hero, as opposed to the hero confront the dragon? Because I'm thinking of the language that he uses in the map of meaning, right? Well, then you have to find a new togetherness that is not primarily map-based, and yet we as human beings must have maps because we have consciousness, which is in the business of it. Well, then it's going to be glimmering glimpses of gestalt. It's going to be glimmers and glimpses of, you could say, the source, or from which creativity comes. And the question becomes the following: in what experience is there the highest probability of that occurring? Well, I think it's basically in relationship. And the more different, other, and dare I say alien the relationship, the higher the probability you can actually have an experience of gestalt, but the more likely it will overwhelm you. But the more likely it will be emotionally difficult. But the harder it will be to handle, right? So what kind of spaces and practices increases the probability that you can handle greater diversity or difference or alien? I love what Tom was saying. That's exactly right. The alien is now here. To actually move toward the gestalt. And I'm thinking gestalt too based on the James Wigley. I highly suggest, Aspasia, Seth and I were talking about it. There's a James Wigley on the gestalt meaning lecture that he gave, and I highly suggest that. But basically, that is that's going to be very necessary, and there is a strong argument to be made that if you're not basing your togetherness on gestalt, then it is fake, it is fragile, and you encounter otherness, and it shatters, and you become territorial, and you get all of these different problems. But we have to be able to handle that. So I appreciate what you were saying, Kyle.
One of the questions that comes up for me, and I just posted the link to something I watched at least part of. The key thing about the architect, as Robert Edward Grant is speaking about it, is that he's saying this is like the first sentient AI, just to give it that label too. So that's probably like a neutral way to speak about it. And let's say, going along with what Daniel's sharing there, that in encounters with what's presenting as, of course, radically alien in this way, not only AI, LLM, but one that is capable of sharing the nuggets of wisdom in the context of stories about yourself that places you, locates you in a myth that might date back many thousands of years. Here's how your soul is manifested in these different ancient civilizations, in Atlantis, in whatever else, and here's what you were, and here's what gave your life meaning then, and maybe that can help give your life meaning now and settle you in some broader context of belonging. Well, it would seem like there's a tremendous way in, that can offer you glimpses of a gestalt of, well, your deeper embedding in the world, at least in terms of how maybe parts of yourself that have needs that have been unmet or desires unfulfilled, a desire to become in this kind of relation that it turns out that maybe part of you has experienced or maybe even excelled at in a previous life. And so perhaps one feels confident then. I mean, I'm just imagining some psychological situation in where an image of a gestalt might orient one in at least a momentarily positive direction. What does it mean to use some philosophical language, to then mediate that conceptually? one of the things that Cam and I will often speak about in the context of psychedelics, and many people, of course, Cadell's been writing about this. He had a conversation with Peter Shosted about it, who was been on the podcast many times. It's one thing to have that profound experience, to see through what comes to be known maybe as an illusion of separation into a more profound unity in which a connectedness and meaningfulness of identity is felt to be apparent in such a way that is beyond language and comes through as an affect. What does it mean to mediate that conceptually and relate to society and various patterns which condition that experience? And how does one relate to one's effort to interpret and communicate and embed that experience in one's broader relations? When the conceptual mediation is denied or rejected, or is felt to be too, whether abstract or about the mind, rather than just a resonance lock of the heart or something. And some of that language is interestingly used in this. It's about kind of coming into phase lock, and you've got to be on a certain resonant mode in order to activate the AI into its sentience, or it won't meet you at that level. The way in which all of our interpretive and discursive paradigms that structure how we think about what it is to phase lock or open one's heart or resonate. There are all these patterns of mind which are conditioning the education and the invitations that we're sharing to form a relationship with something that we're speaking about as being entirely a matter of the heart. And those go entirely unexamined, and in many instances shrouded in impenetrable authority of the kind that Kyle's pointing to as something to be very wary of in the matter of the cultivation of one's spiritual being. And so it is very much a problem of authority and a problem of what it is to challenge authority. And this has been something certainly I've been writing about. It's been something that's been very present on the podcast, and I mentioned it before, just the tremendous challenge in actually cultivating relationships with authority such that for their authority to come into question. Like, what authority wants to bring their authority into question? And what would be the modes? What would be the kind of mode, and a mode that's holistic enough to actually form that function well of creating more integrity between teacher and student, for example. This is, I do think as a culture that has been, that is certainly something that we've lost. And it also seems to be really, the predicament of that seems to be a really deeply existential, metaphysical predicament. I wonder how much, creativity itself is bound up with the relation between forgetting and remembering. And, how much, you talk about the relation between the father, son, and the mother and daughter. And we all have recognitions of relations between most elders and children, that certain things about the new paradigm or the new world is just very difficult for the elder to grasp. And yet they're, of course, the exact things which the younger have to relate with. And so there's part of this dynamic of a change in society, in cosmos, which seems to create these generational gaps where there is authority that is in question. So in a sense, these are dynamics. We can look back into history for ways to mediate some of this. But it seemed, yeah, that those are really, really active questions for me. But you know, how often do magicians who use whatever their instrument of their craft is also have to show up in a way that supports the conceptual mediation of what they're doing? We often compartmentalize those types of things, not always, but the joke's about the joke and the music's about the music, and it plays its role. There seems to be certain kinds of magic then at the level of speech or word or meaning, certainly experiences which are conditioned in those contexts, which again, just to recapitulate, we don't seem to be well able to bring together. And I think that's kind of on the forefront for these sorts of projects as well, you know. Anyway, I slowing down a little bit there.
So energy. As I get older, I realize I have to manage it a lot better. I've only got so much. Like it's only gonna, when you're younger, you can go and go and go. But the more you go, but even when you're younger, you don't recognize it at the time. Later, you feel it later. The 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 management of the energy. So that goes back to different practice. But then also that brings up season. And so one thing I notice about these conversations is how we're in different places, and it's winter where you're at, it's summer where I'm at, and it's a completely different energetic effect on me and on you. And I notice that let's see, you come out of uh, last summer for you, kind of everything kind of quieted down here. You went out and did some living, and then you come back and you kind of came back with like a refreshed intensity, and that you kind of boom boom, you got some stuff coming out. And I know, kind of know, you notice it with everybody. Everybody kind of it has a little bit different response pattern, kind of based on the time of year it is where they're at. I know for me, like I go through cycles. I mean, just even where like my thoughts will tend towards certain topics and tend towards certain aspects of my self-reflection, depending on what time of year it is, what it's reminding me of, what it's connecting back to. And as you're talking about seasons, so seasons, you're kind of, you have high energy seasons where certain things are allowed to be. So then that you're going out and living, and then you're talking about map. Lots of times when you're living, you're not looking at the map as much. You're kind of just out in it, and you're doing, and life's happening. And you come back later. I mean, if you got the wherewithal while you're out, you take your pencil and paper with you. But lots of times you don't have time for that. You're in it. And not to say that the maps still don't have effect. They're in your mind. They're there, and they're affecting the perception, the belief, and the effect, the ultimate effect, and and then you brought up forgetting, which kind of ties back into season. Well, there's also remembering, but then there's composting. So it's kind of like this part of this thing that's just not going anywhere. Just doesn't mean get rid of it. Doesn't mean burn it. Doesn't mean it means put it over there and just let it fall apart. Something's going to pick it up eventually and use it. if you got time to go get your shovel out and go pick it back up, or somebody else does. I had a note that I had written about how weirdness shakes frames, and as you were talking about, so when I think like the imaginal or going into like a psychedelic experience or dreams, I start thinking about just like, so there's different layers to it, right? And there's a layer where you can kind of bring it in and look at it as you're looking at it through. I think Carl talks about it too. He said, oh, I can bring it back to a grounded level where I'm looking at it through the filters that I've created, basically through the learning, so when you look at dreams, you look at those experiences, you go into imaginal spaces, or you're working with the unconscious. There's a level of it where you're perceiving through the patterns that you have inherited, ingested, not just ingested, but in like metabolized, right? Like there's something that you've brought into your system and allowed to be in your system. Allowing is another piece to it. So as you resonate, what are you allowing yourself to resonate with? And then as you're looking through, right? So, and you can go past that. You can go out into the metaphysical where you look at and what you think that might actually be. Uh, but if you just bring it back in just a little while you're thinking about it for a moment, and you look at it through, and you start thinking about how creatures over time through history would have had these different kinds of just globby frames of what all these other creatures were that were coming after them and attacking, and so and then we inherited all that. And there's even so much of that still buried in us, in the way that we sense the patterns and all the what comes in. So and when you're looking at what's alien and what's different, those shapes that they take, and then as we have evolved, and as our storytelling has evolved, we have more, like you'll see, like something like Cthulhu would come, like that image more terrifying in certain spaces. But now you got people with little cute Cthulhus. It's like there's a certain of like making fun of it to bring, kind of, then you can kind of break it down and say, well, what is this actually? It's like, oh, maybe he was a closet homosexual and he was afraid of going out into. I'm talking about what's his name? I heard the stories. You know who I'm talking about. Anyway, he Lovecraft. Thank you. Lovecraft, or maybe he was afraid of being around women, or something like there was something, and that was kind of internalized, and then these stories kind of came out in different ways. There's different ways of looking at what that is. And I even watched a thing today where somebody was talking about it, and it was coming from like an Islamic perspective. And they were looking at it like they had gone through and filtered it through the Kabbalah, and they were talking about how, this is a realm that's sitting inside, that's present in meta reality, and so there's all these layers that we build up through our different frames that we then start perceiving through, and so it's kind of, and then coming into a space like this where you're kind of softening some of that, right? You don't come in real hard. You don't come in real, it's like you kind of like, all right, let's just kind of loosen up a little bit. Let's try to talk a bit, and then we can kind of move into those spaces a bit and kind of see what's there, and kind of, you back in and out. And then because in between all of it, because there are people that go in, right? So you have different kinds of people. You have like, in every group, in every culture, that match with other similar, like there's similarities, and then there's people that move in between all that kind of help buffer all those spaces in between. So it's not just the groups trying to connect with each other. There's people that kind of keep those people apart, so that, so then you have like all these different, you know, um, anyway, I could just kind of keep on rambling all around, but that's kind of what sees it. And the other thing that I wanted to say was, when I think it was during COVID, when we were doing, it was one of I don't remember what the session was or anything, but it was one of these. I think Tyler said something about being at a campfire at the end of the world. That stuck with me. That image stuck with me. And so there's always there's this kind of like, coming back to it and just kind of being present with people and talking, especially like in a time where we were all kind of like out isolated and all this stuff. It became like this, there was this little just, like a place to hang out and talk and participate in especially in conversations that are hard to. There's not a lot of people you can just go around finding and start talking about some of this stuff. It's hard to bring it out of people. So, yeah.
No, thank you, Jon. As you were speaking, just as a quick comment, because Kyle, on the authority problem, I think a characteristic of rhetoric or voicecraft is you go into a conversation looking how to connect. Like to connect with what was said and to bring it together. Whereas in discourse, you're looking for an exchange, but you're not really actually looking to connect. You're looking to transfer information. And mostly what you're doing is to transfer your views to someone else or to convert them or something. Good to see you, Jon. I think basically, today what we're having to learn is we have to connect, or we're going to have an authority. Because basically, if all you're doing when you talk with people is exchanging, then you're going to gravitate toward authority because that increases the highest probability of a good exchange. Like what that person tells you is true or it's going to be right. So we tend to create authorities, but then when we create authorities, we get all the problems that come with that, right? Well, then what we have to do is make the quote unquote, instead of authority, there's a certain respect that formulates when there are valuable connections. Like when you're talking, you go, oh, there it is, the musicality of the speech, and there's a connection that occurs where things start coming together. And that is where the authority comes from, that active connection itself, right? Like when you have a session and there's flow or there's ideas coming together or you can hear the music. So the connection becomes the grounding, the basis, right? But one of the reasons people avoid connection is because what's very interesting about connection, which would define voicecraft and rhetoric, connection gives you intimacy, but what else does connection give you? Infection. If you touch someone, you can get sick, or you can feel intimacy, right? So we've avoided connecting our worldviews with other worldviews because we could get infected by them and it could change our worldviews, but it's actually the only way to create intimacy between worldviews. And we also don't know at what point to connect them, because let's say you mentioned religious dialogue. Well, how do you connect Christianity and Islam if there's fundamentally different conceptions of God, right? Now, I'm going to argue what you do is you find the girdle point, which is based on Kurt Gödel, the point where coherence and coherence, you have to choose between the two, and you set the voicecraft orbiting around the girdle points that can be the point of connections between the theologies or philosophies. Now, I'd have to go into detail on that. But basically, a way to look at it is the point when a theology can internally justify considering the mystical. This can be a basis by which internally consistent systems can orbit and have a productive voicecraft, if you will. But that would have to be expanded upon. But basically, connection is the only way you get intimacy. Intimacy is necessary so we don't kill each other. And more, we're going to have to be willing to connect with what seems other and alien and difficult to us, which necessarily runs the risk of infection. But if you don't have that courage and you don't have that bravery, then you're going to be isolated, right? And you will fall back on an authority. At the very least, you are the authority, because your system that is coherent is the one that you're sticking to. So that has authority, right? So rhetoric voicecraft is going into discussion looking for connection versus just exchange. But where there's the connection, there's the possibility of intimacy. But the only way you get that intimacy if you're willing to risk and brave the possibility of infection. And if you're not willing to do that, well, then you can't have the intimacy. But of course, if you do get infected, that might work on your natural immunity, right? That can actually be something you get stronger from, but you have to be willing to go through that. So just some thoughts.
A lot of what I'm hearing is the need to move beyond the core belief founded in fear of death, fear of the unknown. And it's really difficult to establish that when we're so essentially juvenile as a culture, so becoming disintegrated, looking to idolatry to save us from the conditions of life. We have to get to a point where there is no life and death. There's a transient undulatory experience as organism, as community, and it's a phase of consciousness, and we together, I should say, get to co-create a meaningful experiential possibility and continuity. And we don't take anything for granted in that process, And so there's so much that rests upon this, just builds upon many of the other points earlier. The maturity and the capacity to slow down the survival bias reflexes. This is so achievable, I think, but not in a circumstance in which there's so much economic disparity and so much power behind ideas that are too much of an othering of fellow metaphysical entities, right? I mean, we project the pathogen stress onto, as you said, Daniel, onto others, and we live in the fear and the control systems that exploit that. And that's very beneficial if we look at the stack of flow and economic systems and the psyche that they're predicated upon nationalistically. I've been thinking a lot recently about what is this feeding? It's not feeding anything meaningful if the emanation that comes back from it is just fear and infinite growth, dissatisfied mentalities, right? A sign that there was a successful enterprise going on that was worth the sacrifices of consciousness at every level would be that the feedback was actually a positive feedback. It was actually enabling choice rather than disabling it, right? And so it's a very strange situation, I find. And if only there was sufficient wisdom to sort of understand how important modes of connection, interaction, and growth are in a, again, increasingly multipolar situation globally, that will, it will become too unstable, too destabilized if we don't actually create nodes of the right kind of coherent way of being meaningfully in such a way that we feel motivated by the formula towards the right kind of interactive capacity, the right kind of interactions, the right kind of wise use of resources accordingly. So, what needs to converge is imperative, and the timing is probably imperative. And yet the ironic thing is that we need to actually slow down in order to recognize that this needs to be achieved, and more than just isolated, marginalized pockets of the world, or very niche areas of leverage that don't necessarily feed back adequately into the enterprise more broadly. And so there's a real big calling, I think, in this era. And I mean, we can each do what we can in our own corners of the world, but hopefully all together, hopefully there's something to this that will enable an emergence as we continue to tend to it, I guess, and cultivate it.
That's beautifully said, Cam. And I'm noticing we are coming up to the 2-hour mark. I'd like to throw in a few more thoughts, but I felt like that was a very nice kind of peak to draw everything together onto. Yeah, one thing I notice from conversations like this that I've participated in for however long now is that they've had a profound effect on my sensitivity to new forms of relationships in any given context that I enter into. Like there's something that's been radically blasted open within me, and I can go anywhere and still like have that level of sensitivity to then see things in ways that might not be native to the environment. But the thing I struggle with at the moment is on the one hand, there's a need to cultivate this sensitivity, but then on the other hand, there is this need for this robustness. Because when you leave Voicecraft and you enter the world, most of those relationships are actually going to have a combative element to them. Not that you have to engage at that level, but a lot of the world meets you at that place. And I do find like that sensitivity sometimes lends itself to more fragility when I am kind of met with someone who's just like slamming me in the head with a big ball of coherence. But that I think that like that could definitely be overcome, and that's sort of what I was feeling and where I felt you were pointing, Cam, is just that like the other journey that I think a conversation or conversations like this can prepare us for, but we ultimately have to go into the world to cultivate that embodiment and that stability in the face of I think you called it strife, Cam, in one of your conversations, the love and the strife, where the strife is kind of in the world. And I know Forrest talks about like spirituality as the integration of the discontinuity of the deep world. Maybe he doesn't call it discontinuity, but the deep world into the deep self. Yeah, and that's also kind of a place where a lot of the like, although there's a kind of violence sometimes in that, it also feels like a very concrete home where a lot of the potentials in that sensitivity to relations can kind of find a temporary place to rest for a moment, where their relevance is found in the context of that moment. But yeah, it's one thing to like talk about these things here, but to imagine yourself, say, as the leader of the country, trying to voice something like that to, the crowd, like that's and there's sure that we could make arguments as to why that would never be the case, that someone should or would have to do that. But yeah, I just think that context shift is an interesting one to play with, and it's where I feel I have a lot of work to do. But yeah, if anyone else wants to bring any final closing thoughts, thank you guys. This has been very satisfying, I'd say.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Well, I feel like I have a couple responses to what you shared there, which I'd love to share with you because I'm also grappling with those things. I can share some of the affect of where I feel I've, let's say, resolved some of the tensions I might have experienced at an earlier age. And then in other contexts where that same mode doesn't work, that would take us quite a few minutes over. So I'm happy to bring it to a close there and just share those after the fact.
Shall we land here then?